Pitigwe. After months of speculation, a list of major projects in the so-called national interest has been unveiled by the Carney government. The Indigenous Advisory Council, who will help guide the major projects office work to ensure there are opportunities for equity, ownership, and meaningful participation for Indigenous peoples, has also been announced. For more, our Truth and Politics panel is here. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Thanks to you both for being here with us. Jennifer, let's start with the Indigenous Advisory Council. Many familiar names on there, and many of them vocal advocates for economic development. Your thoughts on the Advisory Council?
I think this is kind of what we were seeing out of Bill C5 with some of the consultations that took place, is it seems like a last-ditch effort. I won't lie, it is a good thing to have those more permanent advisory councils, but I think it would have been more in touch with what the actual reality is by having representatives from the treaties, because what we're seeing right now are people that are unelected, so they are not chosen by the people. Some of those people are, names that have been heavily involved in resource development, and it's nothing against them. It's just they serve an interest to be involved in resource development. And then there's chiefs that, have been strong advocates for treaty that were nowhere to be found on any of those. And, there isn't proper representation in Manitoba either. I've already seen that the Southern Chiefs Organization has issued a letter stating that they're disappointed that they're not included in this. So I think, the Carney government is going to have to go back to the table and refigure out how they're going to consult, because I just don't think this will be effective.
Niigaan, the list is also notable for who's not on it. First Nations in Manitoba, as Jennifer just mentioned, the Métis Nation, Alberta, among those expressing their disappointment as well and calling for a seat at the table. Your thoughts on the Advisory Council and who is there or not there?
Well, one thing that's very notable is that they've got, I'm looking at the list right now, you've got the Manitoba Métis Federation that's on there, and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. If you know anything about the history of the Liberal government and the Métis Nation of Ontario, and then other communities that are Eastern affiliated, there is a notable lack of people who they have very close relationships with in the past. And so in Manitoba, my social media feed is filled up of disappointment, we'll call it. I could use a number of other four-letter words that other people have used to describe this particular council. This, on one level, you were not going to create a council that was going to please everybody. There was going to be disappointment in regions across the country. On another level, force-feeding First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities who are already extremely dissatisfied over the failures within the meetings over the summer. As we've talked about in this panel many times, 2 of those 3 meetings were relatively disasters. Like with the meeting with the First Nations was a total disaster, and the meeting with the Métis, the most important contingent, the Red River Métis from the Manitoba Métis Federation, just refused to go to the meeting. And what are we doing here? And there was a certain quote within the Prime Minister's speech when he announced this morning the projects of the national interest. He said, "For too long, Canada has been asking why, and we need to ask how." And he said, "It stops today asking the question why, and we now will only talk about how." We haven't even answered why. We haven't even answered who's at the table. This is a pivotal, critical moment in which we do have to ask why. And First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, I think, have their own answers to why. They don't have no as the first answer. And I think it would be much better suited to ask a certain set of regional groups, for example, to appoint regional representatives. And I think treaty would have been a very good way to go. That's not, however, how the country's often built. And so that would have been a very complicated process. But you do have regional organizations that could have appointed members that represent their bodies and their interests. And certainly, I think they would have been at least felt welcome to be invited to the meeting or to a council.
Yes, there's been a lot of different opinions online right now. There's been 5 projects that were also announced today: a liquefied natural gas project, 2 mining projects, one at the Port of Montreal, and new nuclear project in Ontario. The PM says the 5 projects would generate $60 billion for the Canadian economy and create tens of thousands of jobs. Your thoughts on the projects, Jennifer?
It's hard to have clear thoughts on this when everything seems to be moving so quickly, which is something that we were, almost expected to see out of a Carney government, was that the projects were going to get moving. I would be remiss to say that the Conservatives probably disagree that it's not moving as quickly as it should be. But in Indigenous land, everything is moving really quickly. It seems like we haven't got the consultation piece down yet. We haven't got how we even the government is supposed to consent with us down yet. This advisory panel just came out yesterday, while announcing projects seems so rushed. And, I say this every time I hear about projects running. We have to have a seat at that table. I know inevitably those projects are going to come. There's not much at this point that we can do to stop that, but bring our people to the table and make sure that we're included in not only the environmental aspects, but also the economy aspects of it as well.
Niigaan, some of the more controversial projects or ideas aren't listed in the 5 things like the Ring of Fire or a new pipeline. Your thoughts on what's on the list and what isn't?
I'd be probably overstating it if I call this the lowest hung fruit that you could pick. But these projects are projects in which you have a number of First Nations and Métis community buy-in on some portions of them, and then you also have the two big kind of no-go words at the moment, especially for areas like British Columbia and First Nations in British Columbia, but then also First Nations across the prairies as well, and as of course pipelines. And so the not moving towards a pipeline and being aggressive with the project from the outset is probably a good strategic move. And if I were to be positive, is I think the way in which this was framed by the Prime Minister in talking about jobs that are being provided, as well as the opportunities involved with economic production within First Nations. I'm not a big fan, and I think many are not a big fan of nuclear projects. However, there is a considerable amount of buy-in within certain First Nations in Southern Ontario. And so I think that there possibly could be some buy-in. I wonder, however, if there are, as Jennifer spoke about a minute ago, is in terms of the speed. There was no announcement today of the partnership of those First Nations from the outset. There was kind of an illusion that there was some conversations, but in the coming days, I guess I'll see whether there is some universal agreement amongst those peoples of whether these projects are going to go forward, and if there's any agreements that are made. So therefore, it would be something that can be hitting the ground running.
These are definitely things that many will be on alert and watching out for, but we'll have to leave it there and continue the conversation over on the podcast. Thanks to you both. Jennifer, back to the Indigenous Advisory Council. How much of a say do you think they will have at the Major Projects Office?
Well, I think, when you're talking about consultation and you want people to really make a splash or an impact by their opposition or their support for projects, you have to put people at that table that have that ability. And there are some names on that list that I feel like have that weight that they carry with them, especially in the space of pushing back or being a strong advocate. Chief Darcy Bear is very well respected in Saskatchewan. He is a chief of a Dakota nation. So you are going to see those differing opinions amongst Cree and Dakota and Lakota, Saulteaux people. Like, we're all different. And even Métis, we see a Métis rep at that table who is not elected and carries a corporate title with him. So how is that person going to be able to connect with the other people at that table? Is there going to be consensus? What happens when that table is divided? So I'm kind of wondering whether or not the Prime Minister picked a bunch of people that he knew would almost agree with one another, or how that's going to go when decisions are deadlocked. I'm just not entirely sure how this is going to work, because I just don't see this being very effective when there are so many voices that represent us left out from that table. I don't see, a First Nations chief from Manitoba. I don't see, a Cree person from Treaty 6 in Saskatchewan. So I'm just not sure how this is going to work.
Niigaan, do you think the Prime Minister is going to need to add a few more appointments on this council?
Or maybe emphasize that there is a major geographical disparity when it comes to most of the projects. If you look at most of the projects, with the exception of one, they're all prairie-based, or from Manitoba West. And three of those 5 are Manitoba West, and then we've got one in Ontario, one in Quebec. These projects, having for instance, Chief Terry Paul from Member 2 First Nation in Nova Scotia, and having some kind of involvement of a First Nation that is so far away from the contexts of those First Nations who will be most directly impacted, it just tells you that this council has many gaps. And it would have been much better suited if you had invited regional organizations. I mean, why do we have regional organizations to begin with? That's a much bigger question for a bigger discussion. Because if not for a moment like this, like if we don't have regional organizations, which for one reason or another, First Nations, just to use First Nations as an example, I mean, the Métis are certainly regionally based and are going to be able to appoint, in terms of Manitoba and Saskatchewan appointees. I have no doubt whatsoever that Lauren Peltier from the Manitoba Métis Federation was someone appointed by David Chartrand, because he would have had to go and get David Chartrand's okay to be able to be on this committee. I am guaranteeing that many of the First Nations leaders on this did not consult regional governance, or other than maybe their own community, did not talk to a larger body like probably the AFN, if that's the body that we want to use regionally to be able to talk about what First Nations interests are. And so what that says is that we've got just many problems. And here's the problem with just dictating this to First Nations, many of whom just heard about this group yesterday, the council yesterday. They put their feet in the sand before anything even begins. They say, absolutely, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to put out a letter, and now I have to be accountable to my members to say I've refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of this council. And now, like, where are we now? Now it's just stonewalling.
Definitely some interesting statements there. You know, Jennifer, do you think that there will be any backlash to the projects announced today?
I think so. I think inevitably there will probably be some backlash. I'm already hearing that some chiefs are upset with the advisory council as it is. So I think we're going to see some opposition to those appointments, and then some of the opposition to these projects as well, especially when we're not hearing of any major announcements for like Indigenous groups being included into those projects. I don't even really know the full parameter of who's involved and what's going on. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that everything feels so rushed that I'm not sure whether or not it's intentional to do that so that we don't have the time to almost organize or get situated with what is happening in front of us. Because it even feels like with Bill C-5, with how quickly that legislation was rammed through, and then, you know, chiefs getting that briefing on the legislation 10 days before it was introduced into Parliament, it just doesn't give us much time. And you know, a lot of our people are dealing with legislation and very Eurocentric bodies and wording that sometimes isn't easy to understand in our language what that actually means for our lands, for our youth, for revenue. So then sometimes it requires, you know, getting advice from different experts or lawyers that do work in the resource industry. I know if I pick apart any project information, I don't know half the time what's going on within that wording because I'm not familiar with those areas. So I think it's all very rushed. It comes at a really disappointing time, especially when we're talking about child welfare and what just happened at AFN to advance that. This just seems like it's putting another big heavy weight onto our nations that, you know, have a lot of things to deal with right now.
Yes, and so Niigaan, how do you see these projects and other projects mentioned by the Prime Minister today playing out?
Well, let's be clear. There's always been projects of the national interest, and they've always been emergencies. Like, this is nothing new. You know, 150 years, there's always something that the Canadian government wants to get done as quickly as possible. And I was very disenfranchised. The most disappointing words that I heard of the Prime Minister today when he announced these 5 projects was, we need to work at speeds that we've never worked at before. That's what they said about the train line in 1885. Which led directly to the conflicts with the Cree, the Métis in Saskatchewan, and a massive set of violence and destruction of communities, and the entirety of a long-standing set of toxic relationships, which are manifested today in farmers who shoot First Nations when they come on their farms. Like, it's always an emergency. It's always a project of the national interest, and the speeding up is an argument that is absolutely, if anything, for all of our viewers, and, you know, it should fall on deaf ears. I mean, they have to follow the appropriate processes. They have to follow their own laws. And most importantly is they have to act justly. They have to commit to what has been a longstanding toxic problematic, dysfunctional relationship and commit to a path that is something that's different. I mean, why did we do the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Inquiry into Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls? Why do we do any of those things unless we are going to act differently? And that's what today is so disheartening, which is that we seem to be just repeating the same processes that have been led us to this mess, which has been 150 years leading into today, and we can act different. We have all the reports that can suggest otherwise. And it starts first off by treating First Nations as real legitimate partners, not just economic partners that you want to work with, but treating with their interests that with legitimacy, with recognition, with authenticity. That's what it will be all about. And I don't always agree with anyone from all sides here, but I can say that you all need to get in a room and work together.
There's definitely a lot to absorb and process through all of this. I just want to thank you both for the conversation today.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks.
Thank you.